my thoughts about what would be success for me, what success would look like for me. It shifted my thoughts about what I needed to do to reach those goals, and then also put into perspective all the help that I had to get there.
I have been wanting to get today's guest on the podcast ever since hearing that he won the 2015 International Society of Bassists Jazz Competition. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and it is my pleasure to bring you this conversation with Mike Forfia. And by the way, you've probably heard Mike on the podcast before. He actually did an interview for the ISB with Victor Wooten. Yes, that Victor Wooten. And we put it out on the podcast a few months ago. So Mike is a wonderful interviewer, by the way, and it just speaks of his intellect and the depth of his thought. If you listen to this, you got to check it out. This was a great chat with Mike, and we dug into career decisions he's made that may seem surprising or maybe even counterintuitive to outside observers, but you'll really, I think you're going to, wherever you are in your career or your life journey, it's really going to make you think about long-term decisions. And I will be brief here, but I've thought about these topics that Mike and I talk about so many times over the last few years. And so this was just a really inspiring and thought-provoking conversation with Mike. We also talk about his journey from Akron, Ohio to the Eastman School of Music, his bass and non-bass pursuits, how he ended up in New York City, and his decision to pursue academic advising, which is his day job right now. His actual title is Student Success Academic and Career Advisor at the New School in New York City. You'll hear a bit of Mike's playing at the opening and closing of our chat, and I would like to give a shout out to our sponsors, Colstein Music, D'Addario Strings, Steve Swan String Bass, Upton Bass, and the Bass Violin Shop. More on them later, but let's dig into this conversation with Mike Forfia. Looking in person at Mike Forfia, who I've wanted to have on the podcast for a while. And so it's great to be here. A lot of people saw you at the 2017 International Society of Bassists Convention, where you were one of the headliners, jazz headliner, Ithaca.
Right.
In addition to that, you were working in the Young Bassist program.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And I've done so many things beyond that. So again, welcome. And from Akron, Ohio.
That's correct.
Okay. All right.
The Rubber Capital.
Rubber Capital. Okay. Yeah. Growing up in Akron. What's Akron? I haven't ever been to Akron. What's Akron like as a place or musically?
Do you want like the specific population numbers? Because I've always known roughly about how many people were there.
Well, I'm interested personally. I don't know if they.
Yeah, you may cut this out. It's actually it's about 200,000 people. I don't know why I always start there. But it's an industry town. Uh-huh. It was the Rubber Capital, Goodyear and Firestone and Bridgestone were started there. And so there was also a tech boom with all of those. It's a polymer capital. So for a long time it was centered around that. And there was music that was the beneficiary or coexisting with all of that for a long time. And then, like many places in the Midwest, that moved. They stopped producing tires there. They moved the major parts of the corporations elsewhere, and it restructured, similar to a lot of places in the Midwest. Kodak and Rochester, mm-hmm. It's about the same amount of people. Mm-hmm. But musically, oh man, it's just such a melting pot. There's everything there. It's one of the hubs for gospel and R&B music in the country. Truly, there are bass players that came up in church in Northeast Ohio that play with Dwelle and Gladys Knight and Babyface and Tony Braxton And so electric bass wise, there were incredible influences there. It was also a jazz hub. It is, the jazz scene there is thriving. It's, all of my friends growing up are still there pretty much, and they've started a jazz festival that has huge funding from the Knight Foundation, and they're getting incredible composition grants for socially conscious works, and they just also are having a ton of fun, and there's clubs to play at all over Northeast Ohio. The musical theater scene is great there. The Playhouse Square area in Cleveland is one of the biggest theater districts outside of New York in the world. So always, I think there's 11 theaters there. I don't know. But it's just such a melting pot of musical styles. It's on the Great Lakes region. It's there's a lot of people that can afford to just exclusively pursue the arts there. The musicians in Akron and Cleveland and the other farther out places, an hour away to Youngstown or a little bit farther to Toledo, Columbus, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Erie, all connect. Cincinnati a little bit farther away, but there are scenes that interconnect, and it's such a fascinating pocket of music that I come from over there.
And you ended up at Eastman in Rochester studying with Jeff Campbell.
Right, so after studying with Tracy.
Okay, so take us to Eastman. Take us from, you at some point discovered the bass and ended up studying with one of the U.S.'s great bass teachers, jazz teachers, but bass teachers. So take us on that journey.
Yeah, studying with Jeff was an incredible privilege and a joy, but I would have to start with undergrad at the University of Akron with Tracy Rowell and Tim Powell. Tim Powell taught electric bass at the University of Akron, and Tracy Rowell taught upright bass at the University of Akron while I was there. And, like a lot of people coming out of high school, I didn't have any interest in making a clear decision on that sort of thing. I was really on the fence between engineering and music. My engineering teacher said, you only have your 20s as a musician once.
Yeah.
And I went into music. I started playing upright in college. I was an electric bass player. I'm still an electric bass player. Started studying with Tracy, ran the gamut. She really, I guess all my teachers were really patient with me. She allowed me to push back on a lot of things that I probably had no right to push back on. And she helped me. I think one of the primary things that she helped me get set up with was the bow and a posture with the bass. As soon as I started playing the upright, I just switched all my gigs over to that, and it was about a year into that before I just tore myself apart. I had to go physical therapy, some time off the instrument, and she and Peter Dominguez, who was at Oberlin about an hour away, helped me get set back up on the bass and get some balance in my playing in my life, and get set up with the bow. And throughout that time, I was pursuing work. I was working on cruise ships in summers, and I started touring with the Glenn Miller Orchestra one summer in undergrad. And so when I got out of school, I had some opportunities that had stemmed from that. And I traveled for about 2.5 years. I think when I was doing my taxes for 2013, I figured out I had like 41 days without a gig in 2013, just playing.
It's a pretty busy year.
That was a busy year. That year, I was only in the States for 8 months of the year, but I somehow put about 32,000 miles on the car, and I was working, playing at a hotel in northern Michigan and working with a wedding band on Martha's Vineyard, and subletting a place in Brooklyn and playing in Akron and Cleveland and Pittsburgh. And so I was just kind of all over. And I wasn't sure what was next. I wasn't really looking at grad school. Tracy was really starting to guide me in that way. And one of the suggestions she made was to go to the ISB convention, which was going to be in Rochester. And I liked Rochester. I had toured there previously and connected with fellow Akron luminary. I shouldn't call myself a luminary, but
you Akron, are a luminary.
With Akron luminary Bill Dobbins, and he had been really gracious with his time. But convention was there, and I had just put in an application for the Airman a Note premier band with the Air Force in D.C., and so that was kind of my big project. I had my sights set on that. I was 23. I wasn't sure I wanted to do it, but it was like, this is a once in my lifetime sort of opportunity, I think. Whoever gets that gig will probably keep it. Mm-hmm. And I've been a fan of the band. I had been a fan of the band for a long time. And I went to the bass convention, and Jeff, in the middle of everything, I don't know if you remember or if you were at that convention, but he was running around like crazy. I think Kristen Korb was the president at that time and was running the convention, but it was on Jeff's turf at Eastman because I think Kristen had just moved. And in the midst of all of that, I just went up to him at a master class and asked if I could play for him, and I played. Asked if I could talk to him about some stuff, and he took an hour out of all of that to sit down with me. He snagged some of the musicians' lunches for us. So I essentially, bought my lunch and sat down with me and told me all the reasons why, if I wanted to go to grad school, it could be a good opportunity. And if I didn't want to go to grad school, I could be just fine and could also be a good opportunity, and help me start thinking about if I did get a call for the Airman a Note audition, which I ended up finding out the next week that I was going to audition with them. But I met Jeff then. And I started, I applied about I applied about 6 months after that. I auditioned for the Airman a Note. It was an amazing experience. I got to play with the whole band for like 2 hours. I was a finalist. I think I had 5 interviews with people whose like ranks I couldn't spell. And a great bass player from Buffalo, Cameron Kane, got the gig. I actually had just met him at the bass convention, and neither of us knew we were going to audition, but he's a sweetheart and a great bass player. And I went back to the gigs that I was doing. I started to kind of try to recollect myself. And I, very last minute, I think 3 or 4 days before the deadline, decided to apply to Eastman and a few other schools, and put together a recording session and got all the essays done and all the applications in and paid the fees. And took an audition in January, right before the Super Bowl. Had a great experience there. Took a couple more auditions. Jeff and I talked on the phone probably weekly, and ended up starting at Eastman in 2014, and it changed my life. I'm kind of rambling. I don't know.
No, it's and it's an interesting. It obviously had the experiences at Eastman, and then they rated it outward past Eastman, right, into moving to New York with this. I'm forgetting the name, but there
certainly, I had grant opportunities the whole time I was there.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole time I was at Eastman, I was concerned because I had concerned isn't the right word. I was a little bit anxious about going to grad school, even though it was an incredible opportunity, and I was really a fan of Jeff, and I thought the program was super hip, and but I had, within a year of graduating from Akron, every goal I had set basically was there. I was playing all the time with great musicians. I was making good money. I was traveling all over the world. I had gotten out of debt within a year of graduating, and somehow I was still like miserable. And I was like, so now I'm thinking about going into debt, even with a good scholarship and a great opportunity. I was thinking about that, and just kept pushing a little bit more. And Jeff kept advocating for me a little bit more, and so I picked up another job, and I picked up a radio show to produce and a TA position, all to help with that. And that opened up opportunities for internships and additional grants. And I think all in all, I received about another $20,000 total with the extra work, with the internships, with the grants that I got for special opportunities for gigs in Utah and Kansas City and around the States. And then getting out of there, the big piece of this was a $10,000 grant to come to New York and work at the Jazz Church, which was sponsored by the Arts Leadership Program at Eastman.
This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings. Our friends at D'Addario want to help listeners change their strings safely and efficiently, and they have a few tricks to help you achieve that. Each time the string winds around the peg, be sure that it lays neatly next to the previous coil as opposed to crossing over itself, which increases the risk of breaking. Wind each string from the middle of the peg outward, making sure never to rub up against the peg box wall, which also increases risk of breakage. Learn more at orchestral.daddario.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. One of the great bass players of all time, Fred Zimmerman, former principal bass of the New York Philharmonic. He was Barry Colstein of Colstein Music. He was Barry's bass teacher. Here's Barry on Fred Zimmerman.
Anybody that knew Fred would say he was one of a kind. I mean, the man was probably the most talented, the most giving. He was the most interesting. Not only was he an amazing teacher, I mean, an amazing performer, he was an amazing artist also. He was truly a great artist.
Along with Fred Zimmerman, people like Milt Hinton, Homer Mensch, Orrin O'Brien, and so many others have had their basses worked on at Colstein's or had instruments made for them by Colstein's. Thank you, Barry, for everything that you've done for the bass world. And folks, check them out at Colstein.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by the Bass Violin Shop, which opened in 2001 as a small double bass workshop in Greensboro, North Carolina. Today, they're staffed by 3 full-time, highly skilled bass luthiers, and they specialize in double bass sales, rentals, setup, restoration, and repair. For nearly 20 years, they have satisfied thousands of clients by offering quality instruments, knowledgeable service, reliable repairs, and superior restorations at affordable prices. Did you know that they regularly ship basses nationally from coast to coast? Contact their team to find out more information about the shipping process and how you can get your dream bass delivered to your doorstep. For more information and current inventory, visit their website at bassviolinshop.com and be sure to follow them on Facebook and Instagram. And during this whole process, you also competed in the ISB 2015 convention, the jazz competition.
I did, yeah.
Which you won.
Thank you. That was a great opportunity. Another sort of last minute decision, nerve-wracking thing that was like, okay, let's go. But yeah, in the middle of that program, I kind of had a jazz upright bass teacher for the first time. Tracy was an incredible teacher, and she was very, very hip in the way that she applied everything she was teaching to my interests with contemporary music and jazz and all of that. But going to grad school was the first time that I had a jazz bass player who also, plays with the Rochester Philharmonic and plays mean electric bass, but really like a student of the jazz art form as a teacher. And I had seen that opportunity with the ISB competition come up, and I said, music competition, no, it doesn't sit well. Mm-hmm. I don't like it, And he's he's such a bass player in that he's such a great diplomat and such a great leader in just understanding all of these diverse perspectives and being able to synthesize them and also offer solutions and suggestions. Anyway, he said he was saying in more ways than one that I should audition, and I got back from a prison arts workshop the day before the audition. I got back from a prison arts workshop the day before the application was due, and I hadn't played upright in about a week, and I got my buddies together and we set up a Zoom mic on a trio, and it got through. And so I'm gonna go to the competition. Jeff helped me structure how to think about it in the midst of everything, just the semester and all of that. Like, all right, I'm producing a radio show and I'm in grad school and I'm doing all this stuff. And he's just thinking I would take a draft of something to him. He'd say, "No, I think you're overthinking it," or just play a concert with these two musicians. They told us it was going to be Bill Mays and Tim Franzek, and so did that. And then I had an opportunity with this hotel gig that I had been doing for a few years at that point to just hole up on Mackinac Island, Michigan, and play a gig every night and think about this concert. I went through the Don Green Performance Success book and was doing some meditating and just like sort of affirmation type work, just to say, hey, it's just a gig and you're not competing with anybody, and just try and shine. Peter Dominguez was running the competition that year, and I think in the description of what we should put together for the competition, he wrote that we were supposed to let our light shine. And I was just like, there were a lot of things about that competition that, I never would have gotten into just for my own ego or what I thought it might be, what the conception might be about competitions, and then got there. And I remember several of the other bass players just being super warm and inviting, and we were shedding and everything the night before, just like, well, how do you want, just doing warm-ups, bass geeking. And
sure.
And then we went, and Bill Mays and Tim Franzek accompanied some of the most incredible bass players I've ever heard for 5 hours. And they pulled us all into a room afterwards, and Buster Williams and Rufus Reed and Martin Wind and who else? Linda O and Yuri Slavic and Mimi Jones. Wow. Anyway.
It's a good lineup.
Yeah, they just like sat us down and talked to us about, I think the first thing they said is, all right, look around. You're not competing with each other. These are the people that you're going to see for the rest of your lives. And Danny and I came out 1 and 2, and my buddy Adam came out 3rd. And I don't know how they made the decision as far as 1, 2, 3, but it was a real blessing, and it was it started some relationships, and it was a mentorship opportunity, and sort of a validation in ways that of how I was approaching this music, and also just a reminder in other ways that it was a good day, and doesn't mean that I'm any different than I was the day before, that anyone else is. I don't know how to talk about this stuff.
It's You mentioned the word mentorship.
Yeah.
Right. And first of all, you my head's spinning because you're going from Mackinac Island to your full-time student, you get your multiple jobs, and then you're like successfully preparing for a big competition and all that. So that's amazing. And then you do that, and you meet these amazing mentors like Rufus Reed and people like that. And we're we're here in New York City now, and you made what I think is a really interesting decision that I'd love to chat about.
Sure.
This academic advising, career advising, which is certainly a form of mentorship. Talk about that advising in your life, maybe prior to this job you had or this job, and what you find satisfying about this, how it integrates into career. There's so many places we could go.
Sure. I guess I don't know how much I thought about the connection there, but I definitely think there is a connection between that experience, specifically the 2015 convention with that competition, and this. But not in a way that I ever would have thought it was then. I mean, I looked at the competition as like, oh, it's a competition. People are going to be competitive, and it's not going to be a place where I would still have friendships several years later that stemmed from that, and professional opportunities that have nothing to do with the award itself and have everything to do with relationships that came from just being in the mix. And so in the process of peeling away my preconceptions about what that is, it was sort of an analogy or a metaphor. I've never really understood the difference, for the career as a whole. Just like there are gigs and there are opportunities and there are awards and money gets exchanged in a lot of ways, and it doesn't mean much if you're not taking care of yourself and you don't have someone looking after you and you're not making relationships with people. And that was reinforced like wholeheartedly at that convention, at the competition specifically. In a lot of ways after that, that was a beginning of a very long summer that was then amplified by the result of that competition. In a lot of ways. It took me about 2 months to even just palate it. I listened to everybody else perform at the competition, and I heard how great so many people were, and it took me 2 months just to accept it. And it shifted my thoughts about what would be success for me, what success would look like for me. It shifted my thoughts about what I needed to do to reach those goals, and then also put into perspective all the help that I'd had to get there. And so with this position specifically, like everything, I guess, that I've talked about today, it came through at the last minute, and I put an application in, and
it seems to work for you.
And just started. Well, that's the way it started. With each of these things, and then, but that's essentially the point where I flicked the switch and said, okay, yes, I'll commit to this, or I'll give this a shot. And the next several months in each of those this is my primary focus. I'm doing a lot of other things, but this is what I'm focusing on. And for this job, this day gig, this, whatever, so the descriptor might be that describes a significant part of my week being focused on correspondence, and administrative work in an institutional structure. The focus here was putting together a resume and a cover letter. That was a 9-hour travel day on a bus on a tour last fall, and calling out to all of my friends and saying, hey, would you read through this paragraph that I've just changed 20 times today? And I'll call you again in a half hour with the next edit. Where putting together an application for the bass competition or for another bass competition where I wasn't as, successful in terms of the award. Anyway, that's a tangent to talk about how that process applied to me. But this job as an academic and career advisor, technically the title is student success. I'm a student success advisor. It's kind of a hip distinction in that it allows us to encapsulate a more holistic aspect of the student experience. I tell students, academic advising and career advising, that's like two ends of a timeline. you learn about the curriculum, and then we help you get jobs and grants and festivals and all that sort of thing. I can tell you what classes you need to take, and I can look over your personal statement, and once I've known you for this period of time, really tell you, yes, you're describing yourself well, or no, make these tweaks. But the student success part is everything in between.
Yeah.
The student success part is just like really looking at everything that could possibly get in the way of being successful in this environment that has become so critical in so many ways, and is also always up for debate about its own worth and value. What you have a music degree. What are you going to do with that? The same thing could be said for so many degrees, the statistics. So
yes, indeed.
Every time that I was reassured that staying on a musical path was sustainable, it has served to be beneficial in this position. There's a lot of perspectives there. And I don't necessarily say, stick with music or don't stay with music. I'm still fairly new here. Those conversations don't come up a ton, although they have on occasion. But also every time someone said, you shouldn't be, I remember I got a cruise ship gig when I was 19, and I was like, oh my gosh, all last summer I worked for $7.15 an hour at a park service, and I was exhausted, and I played musicals all summer for $15 a service, and all summer long I couldn't make. I remember my paychecks after taxes from the park service were like $400 for 2 weeks of work, 80 hours, and
oh no, yeah.
So I got a cruise ship gig, and all of a sudden I was going to be leaving the country for the first time, and traveling around the Mediterranean and the Baltic. And the first person I told about it, this big mentor for me, said, I was never really into that kind of work. And it was like, I was like, oh, you're selling out. That kind of the first real time I'd heard that narrative. And so the connection here between those experiences and grad school and the career coaching that I've gotten from other mentors, like Christian Howes is he's an incredible coach. I mean, he does very deliberately some coaching in that regard, but he's also a consummate freelancer and a great teacher. And every time I've been able to collect a little gem like that, Jeff Campbell has a ton of them. They all apply here. Yeah. And there's also the credibility here that in a way that I didn't have in some of my educational experiences, where someone who is still playing, someone who still is passionate about that, can be sitting on the other side of the desk saying, let's figure it out.
Yeah.
That's an
important bond to be able to have with the person on the other side of the desk.
Yeah. And that's an element in the same way that I had some skepticism about who was on the other side of the desk for me.
Yeah, me too.
Through these programs.
Back in college, yeah.
I'm now 10 years older than a lot of these students that I'm sitting across, and the environment has changed, but I think that even though there are differences between their experience and my experience, part of my experience was that none of this is guaranteed. And my whole adult life, the landscape has been changing faster than anybody's ever seen. Instagram wasn't around 10 years ago. Facebook was barely around 10 years ago. The whole arts organization structures, granting structures, gigs, in all kinds of ways, and then also the pursuit of art forms and what sort of projects people were pursuing were completely different 10 years ago. And so they have a similar skepticism that I'm I'm encountering as well. And so it's perspective on what this side of the table looks like and what it takes to run a school or a music organization. It's just an opportunity for me to continue learning.
This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass. And you know, there's a lot that goes into being a bass player beyond that initial purchase of a bass. We need bass bows, we need bass covers, we need stands, we need new strings, pickups, wheels, quivers, upgraded gear like tuning machines, end pins, repair parts, all of that. And when someone's looking for some new bass gear or to upgrade something on their bass, I send them to Steve's shop. He's located just south of San Francisco in the Bay Area, and he is the largest dealer in basses between Los Angeles and Canada. That is a big distance, folks. Learn more at steveswanstringbass.com. And thank you so much, Steve, for sponsoring the podcast. When I was recently chatting with Gary and Eric of Upton Bass, I asked them, how did they do what they do? How do they build their presence and be so top of mind among bassists around the world? Here's what they said.
My ego doesn't want to say this, right? And Eric's won't like it either. But because of the timing, we couldn't do, again, what we've done.
Yeah. And what they have done is absolutely extraordinary. From their beginnings as an accessories shop online to now making over 120 basses a year. They're coming up, as I record this, on 1,700 basses. They've got an army of satisfied customers who bought multiple basses. They're just really doing great things. They do great work and stand behind their products. Check them out at uptonbass.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, guys.
It seems like I can see the challenges in a role like that. And when I've gone in, I've been asked to speak about music entrepreneurship and the like, given the stuff I do. And I go in and I am so on. All I could tell is my personal experience and like relate some things, but it's a really tricky thing. Giving advice, really. I mean, I am. The older I get, the more hesitant I am to offer. Yeah. the more I think I don't know anything.
This is your show, but could I put you on the spot a little bit?
Put me on the absolutely.
What I mean, I just recently had to go through that. I was just trying to come up with some definitions for some things. I just did a presentation recently to all of the new freshmen. It was my first opportunity to influence the incoming class. And in a way, this is my first incoming class because I started so recently that this is my first time getting to start someone, a group in a program. But you said you come in to talk about entrepreneurship, and one of the things that I did was I tried to define a 21st century musician, and I came up with a few things that I would be happy to share in a minute. But I wonder what you say when you describe entrepreneurship, or what is entrepreneurship for you?
Well, it's a tricky thing, and I've heard this repeated many times, and so I'm always sort of aware when I'm talking to an academic crowd. Like, two of the slowest things to change, the saying goes, are classical music and higher education. And so when those two land together, it's like this unholy mix of just like. But I finding and serving a need is the classic that going back thousands of years at this point, any sort of business, finding and serving a need, and how can you do that? And I mean, that's the simple description to me of what entrepreneurship is. And I think it's very different. It's a very different attitude than the way a lot of us are trained. Whether or not our teachers know it, whether or not we know it, which is kind of this assembly line, like derp-a-derp-a-doo, jobs awaiting, and I think it's subconscious a lot of the time, that training. And I think I was guilty of that myself as a teacher, and probably still am. But and I'm speaking from an orchestral perspective, which is where I come from, but there was this brief era where it really was a little bit more like a trade profession, where you could go and you would be guaranteed employment almost. I was just speaking with Ron Wasserman earlier today, principal bass of the City Ballet here, and he said there was this era where like you could almost just like put out the sign that said musician and the phone would ring. Maybe not quite that much, but almost that much. And that has changed and continues to change, and every 5-10 years it's changing, just like you described. So yeah, I think finding and serving a need, and so it's a new platform arises like Instagram. Well, how can you do that on Instagram? It's something I am not amazing at talking about. I could talk about my own experiences and how I did that, although I backed into it without much intent. But the podcast, James Newcomb of Musicpreneur, he's pretty good at describing that. So folks listening that want to check out, but his definition also is finding and serving a need. Solving a solution for a profit, I think.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting because isn't that like what we all encounter both as students and teachers? I mean, there's Christian Howes, and he's also not the only one to say this, but regarding what you were just saying, is not worried about sharing freely the information that he knows. He puts his curriculum up. He puts there's so many things that he gives away for free because he knows that there's only so much that you can do with just the information.
We're drowning in information.
Yeah, exactly. Without feedback, without accountability, without so many things. And then also just getting into what you're talking about with social media and with the actual platforms changing. Logistics, operations, that sort of thing. And I think that's one of the ways that this position can be so interesting because I can actually see, for lack of a better term, how the sausage is made.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, here's a great idea that has been percolating for a decade. Here's a great idea that gets shot down immediately. Here's a great idea that it's not a great idea for enough people. And then once they decide on what the ideas are that they're pursuing, then the work starts.
Yeah.
How do you even get it through? And I think that's what's so fascinating about this type of work right here with podcasts, with the access to just stories, that I think that's one of the things that's changed the most, I think, in my life in the last 10 years is just access to how it's done. You know, I can watch Joseph Conyers practice daily.
Yeah.
You know, I can hear the sound of his bass, you know, with a passage that he's working on daily. And it's not only that more narratives can be promoted, but I tend to think that the narratives that do get promoted are a better picture of the scene as a whole. You know, because what you do get taught sometimes, or what people hear at some point, I'm speaking generally, but is that narrative of work hard at this and it will come through. You know, and you don't hear about Kenny Dorham driving a cab, and you don't hear about Charles Ives being not only a groundbreaking American composer, but literally writing the book on insurance sales that insurance salesmen would study from for decades to come. You don't hear about the depth of those narratives as people and how they existed in the world. And I think that with the work that you do and the work that so many podcasters and people who are engaging in these diverse like professional experiences can do is really show people there are a lot of examples of how it's been done before, and then there's what you're going to do.
Right, which is not going to be exactly like what anybody does, and learning how to listen to that inner voice is so important, and it's so dangerous, and getting more so to especially with platforms like Instagram and other things, it's so easy to compare yourself to everybody's highlight reel, right? Yeah. This is not glamorous. None of this stuff that we do is glamorous. Sitting on a tour for weeks and weeks and weeks, there's a lot of non-glamour in that.
Yeah.
Or anything that's truly worth doing. And so I think people, maybe even more so earlier in their careers, you can get sort of almost fooled into thinking that everybody seems to be doing awesome. If you hang out on Facebook or Instagram or whatever a long time, everybody seems to be like landing the gig, doing the thing, and part of this are these algorithms promoting this. But like, it is. That's one of the things I find is beautiful about the long form content. Like what we're doing here is you can get a little more in depth on and hear some vulnerability. And when it's been hard and tough decisions.
Well, and I think that's like that's a whole set of soft skills that that is also being promoted by this shift in the landscape. I mean, they're seeing right now in higher ed, they're seeing a huge uptick in the demand for counseling and therapy services. But they can't come up with a cause for it. Not in any sort of reputable, concrete way. They just know that the demand is higher, and for the last 2 generations, the attitudes around it have shifted. There's not as much of a stigma about it. But with the highlight reel, with all of the outlets for the glamorous parts of your life, there also kind of becomes an expectation, or maybe I'm just now becoming coming into my social graces, but nobody, not as many people want to hear about the tough parts. And there's a whole skill set in being able to it's a strength to know when you need to ask for help, and there's a whole skill in just being able to set up your support system, even just to be able to navigate the more vulnerable parts of the conversation. I like to say, I'm stop me if I'm going too far here, but I'm just, I'm between therapists at the moment, just to open up this idea of like, hey, this isn't going to be glamorous.
Right.
This is going to be the most challenging thing I've dealt with this week or this month or a year. And, I don't need you to take this on, but if you can, let's wrap, because this is like, I need to normalize this. This is something big for me that's getting in the way of what could be a very glamorous thing. Or in some regards, some of the best advice I got last year on this tour, there were so many things that were so wonderful about it. I spent a month in Japan. We played 27 or 28 concerts in 31 or 32 days. All I remember is that we had 4 days off, wow. And we played at Orchard Hall in Tokyo, and all of the major composers were up on the wall, and we played at the Cotton Club and Blue Note, and it was so wonderful, and the people just were also wonderful, and it was also really, really challenging in a lot of ways that as vulnerable as I'm comfortable getting, I wouldn't get into on this platform. And just, I guess one of the biggest lessons of my adult life especially is that it's not one or the other. Yeah. It's like things are rarely as good or as bad as they seem, and it's a mix of two, and joy and happiness and peace and trust is a form of active resistance to the very challenging and very real things that can get in the way of every part of this journey. So it's this work that you're doing here, I think, is really important, and I'll applaud you on that. But finding a need
and serving it.
Finding a need and serving it. I like it.
Yeah, that's well, I appreciate hearing that. I appreciate you and what you're doing, and I appreciate you doing that wonderful Victor Wooten interview that we put out for ISB.
That was fun.
And posted on the podcast too.
Fun, yeah.
And we got to do this. We got to make this a regular thing, because I love having people back multiple times.
Sure.
And we could dig into so many things. And I usually wind up the conversation with one question, which is particularly great for you, because it's what would you ask, or what advice would you give an 18-year-old, essentially, which is what you spend a lot of your time doing. But I usually say, what advice would you give your 18-year-old self?
That's
or
funny.
Some age thereabouts. So I don't know if you have any advice for Mike, just about to start University of Akron, or kind of that time frame.
How much time do you have?
Yeah, we have. Well,
can this be the start of another podcast right here? No, For one, I got some really great advice when I was 18.
Yeah.
Jack Shantz, I remember, said, the problem with goals is that you tend to reach them. Mm-hmm. And it was just basically an idea that there's the big luminous goals, and then there's just everything that either aligns with that or doesn't. But in terms of 18-year-old me, I think I got the advice along the way. I learned how to take care of my body. I learned how to take care of my mind. I learned how to prioritize the various relationships or things in my life to my relationships and that sort of thing. Of course, the cop-out answer here is depends on who I'm talking to.
Yeah.
But some of the wisdom that I've collected along the way, and some of this is Jeff Campbell, and some of this is Tracy, and some of this is Peter and various other folks. But there's that cliche, you attract more bees with honey than vinegar. Mm-hmm. There's a value to being patient or persistent and patient and figuring out how to, the soft skills element of this. There's also, Jeff liked to say, try to make advocates, not enemies. One of the ones we promote here with career advising is that you can do it all, just not all at once.
I love that line.
Yeah. That one's fairly new to me, but it hits on a lot of cylinders, or fires on a lot of cylinders. I don't know how engines work either.
But it's true, because I see so many people that I would never have predicted what 4 years down the road they ended up doing.
Yeah.
And again, the older I get, the more I really do think anything is possible. Never write anybody off for any direction.
Yeah. I like to refer to this one. I forget the person who put it together, but the hierarchy of needs. Mm-hmm. There's a reason that's positioned.
Oh, the
right
Maslow.
There. Yeah, Maslow hierarchy
right,
of needs. Right. Physiological needs, safety and security, love and belonging, self-esteem, self-actualization. Yeah. We're like so focused, especially as artists, on that top part of the tier. Mm-hmm. So just a reminder that you need to take care of your body. You need to make sure that you're safe and secure, and that can have any number of connotations. And then make sure you have a support system, that you know that you are loved, that you know that you have a purpose, that you know that you belong. If you can do those three things by the time you get out of college, oh my goodness, you're doing better than me.
Neil Gaiman, the author, has this great saying. He says to himself anytime he's starting to feel frustrated, and he says, "Have I slept enough?" Oh no, I'm sorry, getting this wrong. Have I eaten recently?
Yeah.
Should I take a nap? Is it time for a short walk?
Yeah.
And it's really, and I've thought about that a lot ever since hearing that, because it's really those physical, that baseline of needs. You're struggling with these things that you think might be higher level, and really it's like, I'm just hungry.
Yeah, exactly. There was a book that came out a few years, like a decade ago or something. I can't even remember the name of it, but it was all about water, and it was all this research about so many conditions being related to being dehydrated. You think you're hungry, you're actually thirsty, and all of these things. I benefited a ton from the work with the physical therapist at Eastman. I started going for physical therapy, and then I interned there, and I helped teach a class on keys to healthy music, and that changed my life. But yeah, that first rung of the hierarchy of needs. Are you taking care of your body? Mm-hmm. How can you expect to do anything if you're not doing that? And that's not a criticism to say that like this isn't this, stop that habit, stop this habit, stop that. I think on a more basic level, are you allowing yourself to feel stressed?
Yeah.
Are you allowing yourself to ignore the warning signs? Like a 10-second shift 10 times a day can change your life. Yeah.
Mike, appreciate it, man.
Thanks
for chatting.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Mike, so great to chat with you. And folks, check out what Mike's up to. Learn more about him at his website, MikeForfia.com. Also, definitely check out that conversation with Victor Wooten if you haven't. So great to hear from Mike. And I love having guest episodes like that on the podcast. I've done so little of that over the years. Win Hinkle, who Win's awesome. He's done a couple, I think, past guest interviews. He did one with Rufus Reed, which was fantastic. And so it's kind of a weird shot. Probably like 1% of you are in a position where you would be wanting to do that. But if you do want to chat with somebody yourself and submit it to the podcast, I love that. I think it's really interesting. I, of course, love chatting with people, but I totally think of this as a community podcast. So if you ever want to submit a guest interview, just go for it. And if you want some advice on how to do it, I can provide that as well. Or if you want to get involved in any sort of way, we can always use help here at the podcast. We've got a great team. These are people that stepped up and volunteered after hearing a shout out at the end of an episode. And it's just been epically helpful. I seriously would have quit the podcast at this point if these people hadn't stepped up to help out. So let me give a shout out to the team. Love these folks. Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, they are our audio editors. They go through and edit these episodes. That might not seem like a lot of work. It's a lot of work. I did maybe 400 of these all myself before getting the team on board, and I just can't imagine going back and doing. I just don't have the time for it. I don't have the bandwidth. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Steve. You guys rock. And Trevor Jones is kind of the mastermind behind all the machinations of the podcast, from sending out emails to promoting things on social media and putting out blog posts. I write some, but he puts out blog posts as well, just getting all the nuts and bolts that go into each episode. And there's a lot. You might just think, record, put out in the world. No. There's a lot more that goes on in a podcast. So thank you to Trevor. And then thank you so much to Mitch Mooring of Mitch Mooring Strings, mitchmooring.com, making basses down in East Texas, Louisiana kind of area, not too far from Dallas. So Mitch assembles these episodes, puts them out, puts some shine on them, makes me sound good, makes the guests sound good, and he does such a great job, much better than what I used to do. So thank you, Mitch. And then thank you to Krista Copper, who goes through after these come out and catalogs, archives, timestamps, everything we talk about. And that allows us to put out thematic episodes like standing versus sitting, bow strokes, winning the audition, jazz advice from the masters, and injury prevention. We've done others, George Vance and his influence. We've got many more like that in the works. So thank you to everybody on the team. And if you're interested in helping out in some capacity, hit me up, feedback@contrabassconversations.com, and I can give you some info on what we could use help with. Thank you again for listening. That was long-winded, but I love to give a more detailed shout-out every once in a while to all these people who are spending hours each week on the podcast. I'm Jason Heath. Did I say that? Yeah. Your host, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.